Hi, everybody, and welcome back to the SEC Weekly Show. This is your weekly show for SimFBA football, where we dive into the virtual SEC conference. I apologize for the long layoff. I know the last time we checked in was right at the beginning of college basketball. Honestly, life got a little hectic for me, so we're checking in late now with week 5 of college football in SimFBA. I know that's a long time. There's a lot been going on, so we're really just going to dive right into it as much as we can get to and try and just get us caught up. So let's get started with checking in with what's going on this week. A lot of good matchups. In fact, some really good matchups here, with most especially number 6 Auburn taking on number 7 Georgia and number 1 Tennessee taking on South Carolina. That's two top 25 matchups, including a top 10 in Auburn and Georgia, both of which should be really good games. Um, Hoping that they really live up to the hype that they should be. A couple other games to check in on: Alabama versus Ole Miss. There's a lot of questions going on around the entire league with what has happened to Alabama, and we're going to talk about that a little bit later. Alabama, fresh off their national championship, really struggling this season, and Ole Miss, who's pulling kind of what Ole Miss always does. You know, they're doing decently. Could be a surprise, but there's always the chance for them to basically pull an Ole Miss and fall off. Auburn, of course, number 6. Georgia, number 7. Auburn's having a great season, absolutely killing it, which you kind of expected following up from last year. Georgia has completely turned their program around from a program that at the very beginning of 2022 was really struggling, and in the second and a half of the season started to seem like they had really figured it out. And I think we're seeing Georgia turn the corner into a premier program that you want and expect them to be as that name. Florida taking on Vanderbilt. Florida kind of in the same boat as Georgia last year, but has started to turn things around. And they're kind of in a weird phase right now. They're doing well, but how well can they do, I guess, is really the question for Florida. Vanderbilt pulling Vanderbilt things. They're not as bad as you would think, but they're still Vanderbilt. Kentucky versus Charlotte. Those of you who've listened before, you'll know that I am the coach of Kentucky. This is a Kentucky biased program. So beware of that. But we're taking on Charlotte in the only showdown this week that is not an SEC matchup. Tennessee taking on South Carolina. Tennessee has absolutely been rolling with Brandon Savage behind them and T. Sweezy really nailing down having lost last season, the SEC championship and in the playoffs. Seems to be a little upset, and he is rolling through the entire college football landscape right now. But South Carolina is having a really good season. But I'm trying to remember, but I think we saw this from South Carolina last year too. They started off strong and kind of fizzled out. So can they keep it up? And the Texas A&M taking on Arkansas, both programs, same deal as Florida and Georgia. They start strong, but they have questions. You know, what can they do? But LSU, Mississippi, Missouri taking a bye week this week. So that's 5 SEC matchups going on this week. Uh, Two of them being the top 25 showdowns that we just talked about with Auburn and Georgia, Tennessee and South Carolina. And that's 4 teams in the top 25. All 4 of them you see right here, and all 4 of them are in action. So let's jump right into it. Our first game is going to be Alabama versus Ole Miss. And Ole Miss absolutely demolishes Alabama. It's 34-3, but that really doesn't even tell you how badly Alabama did. And this is Alabama's 6 points on the season. That's how many points they have for the entire season. It's just 6. I may need to check that again, but if I'm counting correctly, if I'm remembering correctly, they only have 2 field goals on the entire season. They go into this game not understanding like what's going on with their program at all. I think we've discussed it a little bit in Discord. We think the best we know of what's going on is this season there was implementation of penalties for changing your scheme. And Alabama has changed their scheme almost every week since the season started, and that has really punished them. I don't know if they're doing it on purpose, on accident. Maybe they're testing something. Maybe they're trying to figure out their team with a bunch of graduations from last year, possibly. I don't know. Nobody knows what's going on with Alabama, but this loss takes them to 0-4. The national champions from 2022 ran through our 12-team playoff. Now 0-2 or 0-4 on the season, 0-2 in the SEC. Only 16 to 38 on their passing for 117 yards. Don't throw any touchdowns, of course, like we just said. Throw one interception, but they don't take any sacks, so I guess that's something to look at. 9 different receivers, which is a lot higher number than we saw last season. I think the most we usually saw last season was 8. But for those of you out of the loop with implementation of stamina this season and backups actually going in and moving in throughout your depth chart instead of just taking those top 7, now we're starting to see more and more guys get into the game. Ole Miss on the flip side, 32 of 48 of passing, 246 yards, get a touchdown to the air, but they do take 2 sacks, which when you're playing a team that right now is as bad as Alabama, 2 sacks is not something great to see on that resume. Alabama runs it with 3 different guys, but only 59 yards. Honestly, they could not get anything going. They don't even amount 200 yards with the offense here. And that's not even their worst game on the season. They've had a game this season where they didn't amount 100 yards. So I don't know much to say. I can beat that bus all day of how bad is Alabama right now. Now, Ole Miss will take it to 4 different guys for 42 different attempts and 244 yards. So they get it done through both the air and the ground. Most of their touchdowns, of course, coming through the ground on those 3. But Nick Hancock being their player of the game with 209 yards and 2 touchdowns just by himself at that running back position. Defensively, not a great game. We're seeing a few less tackles for loss here. I don't know if that's just this week or if it's another factor of the updates that we've seen, but only 4 tackles for loss for each team. Alabama doesn't take any takeaways. Ole Miss takes 1 interception away. Alabama gets to the quarterback twice and tackles him. Of course, there's no extra points. Alabama sinks a single field goal for 45 yards, missing the other one, which was about 54 yards, so you can't blame them that much for that. But they're not generating any sort of offense. They're not able to get down on the field. They're basically playing the entire game almost entirely on their half of the field. Now, Ole Miss has a perfect day instead. They go 4 for 4 on their extra points, 2 for 2 on the field goals, with the longest coming from 35 yards. So like we said, Alabama's falls to 0-4 in the season overall, 0-2 in the SEC, which is going to be last place in the West. And if you ever thought you'd see Alabama, if you've grown up in the 2000s like most of us have, Alabama in last in the SEC is just a weird thing to see. Now, that said, there's Ole Miss, 3-2 overall in the season, 2-0 in the SEC, and they're first place in the West. But we saw this last year. Again, they started off strong and they kind of fizzled out to the end and finished right in the middle of the pack. So Ole Miss has got to keep this pace up, and I think they can. There is some challenges for them in the schedule coming up, some really good teams. But if they can continue this stretch that they've been on, I think Ole Miss will be in a really good spot and continue to propel that program. Checking in with our next game, it's going to be the game of the week. Auburn taking on Georgia, and of course we see Auburn basically smashing Georgia. And I picked this one as the game of the week because it was the most fun to watch. As you can see just by the stats, there's so much going on in this game, and none of the games this week were really close. Almost all of them are pretty much blowouts. But this one was probably the most fun to watch. Unless, of course, you're Georgia and you lose by 30 points. But it's respectable. Auburn does win 54-24. They go 42 of 59 on their passing, and I think they use multiple quarterbacks in this game. Like I said, we're starting to see those backup quarterbacks start to get reps. But Andrew Moncrief is just a monster. 594 yards through the air for Auburn. 5 of their touchdowns come through there. They only give up 1 sack. They hit 8 different receivers. Now, Georgia doesn't have a bad day at all whatsoever. 21 of 41 on their passing, 391 yards in the air, 3 touchdowns, but they do throw an interception and they take 2 sacks. And they don't spread the ball as much on their depth chart. We only see them hit 4 different receivers, which is a very low number that we've ever seen. So they're not spreading the ball, but I don't think that's really a detriment. just by updating my stats today, it may be anecdotal, but I've seen that the more you concentrate into just a few players, the better you'll do. Doesn't work out for them here, obviously, but when you see teams running with 5, 6 different rush attempts, uh, they seem to be losing more often than teams who are running with 2 or 3 different guys instead. And that's just anecdotal. That may not be the case at all. But on the subject of the rush, Auburn kind of doesn't really run the ball at all. I mean, Moncrief has got an arm. He's slinging that thing all over the place. Auburn's got over 600 yards per game on the season, number one in the entire country on yards per game for all of college football. So they don't really need to run it, and they don't do that here. They only run it 20 times for 42 yards total, but they do get a touchdown off of it. Georgia, on the other hand, is trying to spread it out, get everybody involved. 3 different rushers, 33 rush attempts on that kind of opposite spectrum with 486 yards. They'll get touchdowns out of it, but I mean, they're trying to involve both aspects of the game. Now, Auburn has an interception, 2 sacks, and they get 4 tackles for loss. But kind of what probably killed Georgia here is the 3 fumble recoveries that Auburn picked up. That's a big number by any measure. Georgia doesn't take any interceptions, doesn't take a sack, does pick up 1 sack, and they get 4 tackles for loss. And ignore that blocked field goal. I don't think they actually had one. I forgot to remove that. That's my fault. So they did not have a blocked field goal. Auburn, you cannot have a better kicking day than they did. Perfect on their extra points, 6 for 6. Perfect on their field goals, 4 for 4, with the longest coming from 48 yards. Georgia's probably got a little bit of work to do, but maybe it's just a struggle for that entire day. They do go perfect on their extra points, but they missed 2 of their field goals, so they only go 1 for 3, and the one they made was a chip shot from 19 yards. I do think the other 2 were pretty long. One was about 50 yards, and the other one was in that 40-yard range. So not easy field goals, but still something you've got to find a way to make. So that's going to move Auburn to 4-0 overall and 1-0 in the SEC. So that's going to take them to second. Georgia's going to fall to 3-1. That's their first loss on the season. And unfortunately, it's their first SEC loss. So it's going to move them to 6 in the East. But this early in the season, that's not something you can really pay attention to. Georgia's a good football team. They're going to continue to be good. I would expect to see them in the top 25 next week as well. We'll find out tomorrow. But a disappointing day for Georgia, a great day for Auburn. But there are things to take away for Georgia that you can keep your head held up for, especially with where they were last season. Checking in with our next game, it's Florida taking on Vanderbilt. And of course, not that much of us would really expect anything different. Vanderbilt takes another loss. Florida 31, Vanderbilt 17. But not the best day from Florida. Not really a passing team, it seems like. Only 9 of 24 on their passing, a 37.5% completion rate. That's not going to do it against teams who aren't Vanderbilt, Only 103 yards through the air, a single touchdown. They hit 7 different receivers. But again, they probably just really aren't a passing team. I haven't delved into it that much. That's on me. But they run it through the ground. They involve 4 different rushers. They run it 51 times, so over twice as many times as they try to pass it for 334 yards, and that's where all 3 more of their touchdowns come from. Vanderbilt 21 of 34 passing. So really, if we look at this Vanderbilt stat line, it really was a good day for Vanderbilt. Vanderbilt is not as bad as their record shows. 217 yards to the air, a touchdown, do throw an interception, and they take 3 sacks, which is bad. I mean, I don't know how else to say it other than that's bad. They also involve 4 different rushers, but they run it only 34 times, which is still quite a bit, and they get 219 yards out of it and a touchdown. Florida's defense had a great day, taking away 1 interception, 3 sacks, 6 tackles for loss, and they do pick up a loose football. Vanderbilt's defense didn't really seem to want to do much today. Of course, plenty of tackles, but we don't talk about tackles here. We only talk about the big plays, and they only have 2 tackles for loss. No interceptions, no sack. Really not putting a ton of pressure on the Florida offense to help them out at all. Both teams go perfect on their kicking. Florida hits all 4 of their extra points. They also hit a field goal from 43 yards out. Vanderbilt hits both of their extra points, and they hit a 27-yard field goal. So Florida's going to go up to 3-1 on the season, 1-1 in the SEC. Vanderbilt's going to fall to 1-4 and 0-3 in the SEC. So they're 1-1 outside the conference. And these games that they have been playing have been very close. Not the typical Vanderbilt you see. I mean, yes, they're still losing, but these are very close games, and that is going to come up later when we start talking about recruiting. Moving on to our next game. Of course, you know I get excited for this one whenever the Blue Star is there. Kentucky taking the win 41-0 over Charlotte. A great bounce back. Kentucky has a difficult start to the season, taking a big loss to USC. Got doubled up on. I think it was like 45-21 or something like that. Not a great start, but they follow that up with wins over Charlotte and a win over. Man, I completely forgot who else we beat. My point is, we won our second game, and for a program who just 2 years ago was in the semifinals of the national championship, this is an important step. We really struggled last season, going 5-7 overall in the season, missing a bowl game, finishing in the bottom half of the SEC East. Not promising, but right now we're looking up. And this is really a game you don't expect when you look at the Kentucky offense. It was mostly done through the air. That's not what you expect to see with Kentucky, who's running a spread option offense and who has legs with Michael Oliveros and has legs with Kelvin Dupree. I mean, yes, we have Logan Njoku, who is a very good wide receiver, and we have other wide receivers, and of course, Kelvin can also catch the ball. But with a spread option offense, 28 of 38 passing attempts with 289 yards and 5 touchdowns to the air is not something you expect to see. Now, this also includes the fact that we ran 3 quarterbacks that day. Of course, Michael Oliveira started. Then we brought in Caleb Hoskins, who's also a scrambling quarterback, as a backup. He ran really well. And actually, again, when we talk about not a typical Kentucky day, 21 rush attempts on 94 yards, not very much. The leading rusher was Caleb Hoskins, who ran one time and broke off a 40-yard run. So a very odd day, but a very good day, promising day for Kentucky. Also stepping up on the defense, probably performed the best of all defenses in the SEC this week. Now, granted, we played Charlotte, like we just kind of said, so not a ton to really brag about there, but 3 interceptions, get to the quarterback twice, and have 13 tackles for loss. Go perfect on the extra points, 5 for 5, 2 field goals as well. The longest one coming from 40 yards. That's going to take us to 2-1 overall in the season, 1-0 in the SEC. Charlotte really has a tough day. There's not a ton to say there. 26 passing attempts. They get 14 of them completed. 175 yards through the air, but they do give up 3 interceptions and they take 2 sacks. 37 rush attempts, 104 yards. I mean, they really couldn't get anything going, but this is a team who's now 1-4. So I'm going to brag, but I'm not going to brag too much because it is still just Charlotte. So let's move on to our next game, which is what I thought would be the game of the week, and it really didn't turn out to be. Tennessee taking on South Carolina, number 1 versus number 12, and I mean, yes, we expect it, but Tennessee trounces South Carolina. I kind of expected this game to be a lot closer, but maybe I put too much faith in South Carolina than I should have. Maybe I should have known better. 44-13. Of course, Brandon Savage does Brandon Savage things. 35 of 50 on his passing. He goes 490 yards, gets 4 touchdowns. But odd, and this is a problem for Savage if he's going to elevate to that next level. And I know he's, I believe, a redshirt sophomore. Um, but he throws 3 interceptions and he takes 3 sacks. It, there's got to be a next step that he's got to take, that Tennessee has to take. Without the run game, that Tennessee has no run game. As we can see, they only run it 21 times and 78 yards. And T. Sweezy has said this just as much. They have no run game. They are completely reliant on Savage and his receivers. 3 interceptions is going to come back to bite you when you play teams who are more reliable than South Carolina. Now they get 4 touchdowns through the air, 2 touchdowns on the ground. Defensively, they have a pretty good day too. They take away 1 interception, get to the quarterback 3 times for 3 sacks, 5 tackles for loss, and pick up a fumble recovery. 5 of 6 on the extra points. You hate to see an extra point missed, but in this situation, it doesn't turn out to matter, of course. And they hit a field goal for 28 yards. South Carolina has a really rough day for a team who's ranked number 12 in the country. 16 of 27 on their passing, only 181 yards. They don't get any touchdowns through there at all. Somebody had to have a touchdown. I don't think I did something right here. Throw an interception, give up 3 sacks. On the ground, they only get 81 yards on 27 different attempts. No touchdowns there as well. There was a touchdown somewhere. I've missed something. We'll find it. I'm sure somebody knows. They'll correct me. They'll laugh at me. It's fine. It's fine, guys. But defensively, on the big plays, they're there. They take 3 interceptions. They get to Brandon 3 times for 3 sacks, and they have, well, those are 3 tackles for loss right there. Kicking, they do well, of course. 1 extra point. They get 2 of their field goals, with the longest one coming from only 33 yards. So that's going to take Tennessee to 5-0 overall. Should, of course, continue to be the number 1 team in the country. 2-0 in the SEC, so they're going to be leading the East Division. South Carolina is going to fall to 3-1. That's their first loss of the season. 1-1 in the SEC. It's going to take them down to 5th in the East, but again, this early in the season, those standings can't really count for much because everybody has played 1 game at least, but some teams have only played 1. And I'm sorry, guys, we may take a little bit of a quality hit here and a little bit of a skip. The headset that I thought I charged, I was using, apparently didn't charge, so it just died on me right as I was talking. I apologize for that. Getting back to season hiccups. We'll figure it out. It'll all be cool. So let's check in with our final game this week, which is Texas A&M versus Arkansas, and Arkansas just demolishes Texas A&M. 49-17 final score. It can't be that terrible of a day when you're talking about Texas A&M. There are huge concerns with the 4 interceptions, obviously, but you still get 178 yards to the air. You got to think if you don't throw 4 interceptions somehow that you get a lot more opportunities, you continue to get more yards, you put more points on the board, and you try and make this game closer at least. 32 rush attempts, get 201 yards through the ground. They get their 2 touchdowns from there. Arkansas, on the other hand, offensively has a day, if you can say that. 20 of their 32 passing completions, 290 yards to the air, get 2 touchdowns as well. They do throw a single interception and they take 2 sacks. Doesn't really seem to end up mattering or affecting. Really where they get it done, of course, is on the ground. 48 rush attempts, most of those coming from Kurt Adimbo. Somebody tell me how to say that. On the total, they get 358 yards, but Kurt gets 295 of those for himself. Of their 5 rushing touchdowns, he gets 3 of them. So, they're getting everything done through the ground. They do have a balance, of course, with 290 yards through the air and 2 touchdowns and 358 on the ground. But most of that seems to be coming from a single guy. And if that guy gets hurt, where is your team? So, great game for him. I hope he can continue. I hope he doesn't get hurt. But if you're looking for a weak point in Arkansas from this game, that could be it. You see the same thing with Tennessee with Brandon Savage, too. Defensively, Arkansas has a great day. We talked about the 4 interceptions. James White pulls 3 of them by himself. They get 7 tackles for loss, so they're getting behind the line of scrimmage, even though they don't hit the quarterback himself. Texas A&M pulls an interception for themselves, get to the quarterback twice, and 6 tackles for loss in the whole day. Kicking wise, it's a different story. Texas A&M has the day they're supposed to. They make both their extra points. They kick a 34-yard field goal. No complaints. Arkansas gets their chip shot 32-yarder, if you want to call it a chip shot, but they miss 3 of their extra points. They make it up with the single field goal, which is why they still end up getting a round number from their 7 touchdowns. But you cannot miss almost half your extra points when you're playing a team who's better than Texas A&M. When they're going to go up against Auburn, when they're going to go up against Ole Miss, when they're going to go up against LSU, you cannot miss half your extra points. So they have got to figure that out if they're going to be better than the middle half of the SEC West. Texas A&M taking the loss is going to fall to 2-2 overall in the season, 1-1 the SEC. Arkansas is going to go up to 3-2 overall and 1-1 in the SEC, and it's going to put them in third in the West. So that'll be all the games for this week. Checking in with our play of the week probably isn't any surprise with how much we've talked about it, but it's of course Brandon Savage. Tennessee just trounces number 12 South Carolina. Wasn't even close. Didn't make it look like they deserved to be into the top 25. But Brandon for himself gets 35 completions, 490 yards, and 4 passing touchdowns. So that's going to add to his Heisman campaign, which currently, as of week 5, the number 1 guy is Brandon Savage. The closest guy I can think of off the top of my head, and I really just know the SEC, is Andrew Moncrief in Auburn. But right now, Savage is kind of running away with it. He's got 2,509 passing yards on the season and 21 passing touchdowns. Most people are not coming close to that. Yes, we've talked about the interceptions. That is a big concern. But if he can continue at that clip, then the interceptions don't really matter. When you've got a 68.75 completion rate, when you're getting 2,500 yards and we're not even halfway through the season, you've got 20. I mean, it's kind of insane. So he's your Heisman favorite right now. He will continue to be as long as he continues that clip. And I'll try not to make him the player of the week every week, but it's going to be hard because of how good he's playing right now. Checking in the standings for the SEC here in week 5. Ole Miss right there on top in the West, and Tennessee leading off the East. But again, like we talked about, this early in the season, you can't take these standings too much to heart. Ole Miss, yes, is on top, but they're 3-2 on the season. Auburn's undefeated, but that was their first SEC game with the win over Georgia. So that is going to flip. At some point, Ole Miss is going to go down. Auburn's going to come up, probably when they play. But, that's where we're at right now. So Ole Miss, Auburn, Arkansas, Texas A&M in the 4th spot, LSU, Mississippi, and coming in at the bottom of the SEC West and then bottom of the entire SEC, which I don't think anybody expected, especially coming off the national championship season, is Alabama at 0-4. In the East, Tennessee's leading everything off. Kentucky right behind them at 2-1, 1-0 overall. 2-1 overall, 1-0 in the SEC. Missouri right below that at 1-2, but 1-0 in the SEC. And then Florida, South Carolina, and Georgia all 3-1. Florida 1-1, but of course they just beat. Florida 1-1, South Carolina 3-1, 1-1 in the SEC. I'm sorry. Georgia 0-1, taking the loss from Auburn. That's an interesting mix in what you would call the bottom half of the SEC East, and it's really not. That's the 3 teams outside of Tennessee that are going to compete for the number 2 spot. I'd like to say Kentucky's there, but I can't say it with any sort of confidence right now. Vanderbilt running it out as, perhaps as a surprise, only the second worst team in the SEC. But they're not as bad as their record shows. I think I said this before. They are losing, but their games are extremely close. They're getting the yardage, they're getting the points, and most of those losses are very close. So, yes, they're in the bottom, but 3 of their games have been SEC games. They've played the most SEC games of any team, and it's not going to go well when you're Vanderbilt in the SEC. So that's your standings through week 5. Expect that to shuffle quite a bit, even in just the next week. But that raises the questions we've got right now. In the West, we're talking about Auburn. Is Auburn the real deal? We saw something similar to this last season, but when they challenged Alabama at the very end of the season. Iron Bowl was for the Western Division title. Can they keep this up? Can Moncrief keep this up and really take over the West and potentially take over the entire SEC with how well they've been playing? Maybe. Ole Miss, can they sustain it? Can they not pull what Ole Miss does and fall off in the second half of the season and really just end up in the middle of the standings? And can they challenge Auburn for that top spot? Right now they're holding it with being undefeated in the SEC at 2-0, but they've got to hold on to that somehow. And for Alabama, the worst team in the SEC, what is happening? That Funk, if you watch this, which I wouldn't blame you if you don't because it's terrible, but somebody has to ask him, what is going on over there? Are you tanking? Are you experimenting? Or has there been a lot of changes in that Alabama roster that we're not paying enough attention to help us understand what is happening in Tuscaloosa? But over in the East, Tennessee, can anybody stop Tennessee? Can anybody stop Brandon Savage? Right now, they are the best team in the country. They don't really seem to have a challenge for that or for anybody to really stop them. Kentucky, are we back? Have we figured out the game plan? Are we going to be able to challenge Tennessee for that top spot? We'll figure that out soon. And Georgia, are they the dark horse contender for the SEC East? Like we said, they struggled in the first half of the season last year, but really turned it around and I think ended up 7-5, went to the bowl game, had a nice bowl game, and are looking really good here to start the season, the Auburn game notwithstanding. Are they the team to really be paying attention to right now in the East? We're going to find out because next week they're going to take on Kentucky. That's going to be a good matchup. It's going to be a good measuring stick for both programs to figure out which way they're going on the slider. Kentucky was at the top and kind of everybody was afraid of them until I became the coach and then screwed it all up. Are we going to continue the downslide or can we correct the track and move it back up? Now, Georgia is on the uptick right now, but are they going to hit a speed bump going up against Kentucky going into Lexington and they're still in a rebuild? Or have they turned the corner already and are going to make a statement this week as, hey, we're here in the SEC East and you've got to come to us first before you do anything else? Missouri's going to take on LSU. Mississippi State's going to take on Alabama. Ole Miss versus Arkansas. Auburn's going to head down to Texas A&M and continue to do Auburn things probably. And then South Carolina versus Florida is another measuring stick game for both programs. Is South Carolina as good as they have shown at the beginning of the season? And is Florida starting to figure out things just like Georgia and going to continue to elevate? Of the two games, of the games next week, the Kentucky, Georgia, and the South Carolina, Florida games are the two I'm going to be watching the closest because it's going to tell us the most about those 4 programs for this season. And then Vanderbilt's going to head on the road to Louisiana Monroe as a sole non-SEC game and a road game against a group of 5 opponent. Tennessee is going to give the entire country a break, and they're going to take a bye week. let us breathe without having Savage breathing down our neck. So appreciate that. That's what your next week looks like. Of course, I don't have rankings on here like I usually do and how those update because they don't come out until tomorrow, but I'm trying to get this out to you guys today. So instead, let's go in and check in with our SEC weekly recruiting rankings. Just like the conference standings, these are skewed this early in the season. The more recruits you have, the higher you get. East Carolina's checking in at number 1 with 9 recruits, leading the entire country in the amount of recruits. I can't speak to the quality of them. I'm sure they're not bad at all because East Carolina was a program we were watching last year as well. But our two SEC teams, Georgia in at number 8, pulling in 5 recruits, and Florida down at number 25, pulling in 3 recruits for themselves. Over here on the left, I usually have here the recruits that have committed for this week, but since I haven't done a show until now, these are all the recruits that have committed to SEC schools since commitments started, which I believe was week 3. So this is 3, 4, and 5 weeks of commitments. And the important thing here is to look at the quality of talent that is coming into the SEC. The best conference in the country is pulling the best talent in the country. And there are some surprises in here, but just to start off, you've got Ole Miss pulling in 2 five-star recruits right off the bat in Thomas Greer as a cornerback and offensive tackle Eric Atkins. Florida pulling in a 5-star quarterback Maximilian Howard. Georgia pulling in a 5-star quarterback, Sergeant Slaughter, and I don't know, Sarge, that name sounds kind of suspicious. Sounds like a little hometown cooking. I don't know, but you got yourself a 5-star quarterback there. There are some surprises in here, though. We've talked about how poorly Bama has done this season, but they are still pulling the recruits like you would expect a program like Alabama and like a program who just won the national championship to do. They get a 4-star inside linebacker in Clemens Popafinkel. They get a 5-star offensive guard in Chris McDougald. And down below, they've got a 4-star running back from Robert Craig. So maybe it is a case of Alabama graduated a lot of talent, didn't have it to back it up this year for whatever reason, and really they're just focusing on the next couple years and putting full effort into recruiting, because pulling in a 5-star and 2 4-stars is not really anything to sneeze at. It's kind of scary for a program in the situation that they're in right now. Then you've got a few more surprises. The biggest one probably being Vanderbilt's right in that same spot. They're pulling just as good as guys as everybody. And if you are one who wants to see Vanderbilt continue to fail because they're Vanderbilt, it's going to be tough in here in a couple years. They've pulled 3 4-star recruits right here. And one of them's my fault, I feel like, because Timothy Prohaska, the 4-star defensive tackle, is from Louisville, Kentucky. And if he's not going to go to Louisville, which he shouldn't go there either, he should be coming to Kentucky. So I'm going to take the blame on that one, that this kid is going to Vanderbilt for some reason. But they're also pulling in a 4-star strong safety in Richard Anderson, and they're pulling in another 4-star running back from Donald Manning. And these guys are from all over the place. They've got one from Kentucky, the guy right there from Springtown, Texas, and Sterling Heights, Michigan. I mean, they're not recruiting within Tennessee, or they haven't got any commitments from within Tennessee, so they're pulling all over the country. The AI recruiting for Vanderbilt is something to continue to watch and is going to be competitive and something that we kind of need to watch out for. Georgia, we talked about them, number 8 in the country right now in our rankings. The 5-star quarterback we just talked about, but they've also pulled in a 4-star offensive guard, a 4-star defensive tackle, a 4-star inside linebacker, and a 4-star defensive end. So that's going to be a scary defense for them here in a couple years. And Tennessee pulling in some weapons for Savage's last few years as well. A 5-star wide receiver in Joseph Clean, a 5-star wide receiver in BJ Flash, and a 4-star cornerback in Wendell Gallagher. So pulling in what they need to continue to compete at the highest level. You just hope for their sake they've got somebody behind Savage when he graduates here in a couple years to utilize these weapons when they start hitting their peak. So that's going to do it for our show this week. I appreciate you guys' patience. I missed rambling to you guys. I'm sure you didn't miss hearing me ramble and pause and hit all these so's and ums and yeahs and whatever. But if you happen to make it to the end of this show, I appreciate it. And if you aren't a part of SimFBA and you watch to the end of the show, first of all, A, you're crazy. B, come check us out. Links will be in the description. Come check out the website. Come talk to us on Discord. We'd be glad to talk to you. We'd be glad to continue to ramble and get passionate about this sport. We're just in week 5, so we are halfway through the football season, but that means there's still a second half of football. I had 2 personal friends who just signed up, and they're really excited. There's plenty of teams still available all over the country. We just added FCS. Technically, they're not coachable yet, but in the FBS, there's still plenty of options. There are teams in the SEC to still be taken. We'd be glad to have you guys. We'd love to ramble with you and get competitive and smack talk you a little bit. So check out the description if you haven't joined already. If you are here and you made it to the end, thanks. Hope to talk to you guys next week. I'll try and get back to doing these more often. Just a really hectic work schedule right now, working in minor league baseball, but I enjoy it. I hope you guys enjoy it, and I hope to talk to you guys again next week.